Hello and welcome to the second day of Zoology Live 2022, and you may notice a bit of a change of scenery. We've left the museum today and instead we're in the beautiful surroundings of Cambridge University Botanic Garden. Today we'll be exploring how we monitor and conserve wildlife, with experts Julia Mackenzie sharing how she studies nesting birds here in the garden, and Ed Turner discussing his research into insect diversity in the rainforests of Southeast Asia. Both will be joining us live today, so do get your questions ready for them in the comments on YouTube. But before we get stuck into the science, I think we should have a little bit of an explore of the wildlife of this amazing garden. Set over 40 acres in the centre of Cambridge, this really is a haven for wildlife. Here are just some of the wildlife sites we've seen here over the last couple of weeks. The scientists we have joining us today work to better understand biodiversity by monitoring wildlife. But we can do a huge amount to support wildlife in our own green spaces. Here's the first of our top tips this evening: providing water in your garden.
All animals need water to survive. Some live in the water itself, while others need it to drink and wash. Sadly, ponds in the UK have been disappearing, and wildlife relying on a supply of still, fresh water have been suffering as a result. If you can add just a bowl of water, or even go as far as to build your own mini pond, this would help a lot of species. Creating a pond is one of the best ways to provide a diverse range of habitats and attract a wide variety of new species to any outdoor space. If you only have a small garden or no outdoor space at all, then don't worry, as a mini pond that fits in a window box can still go a long way. Even something as simple as a bowl of water on a windowsill can attract freshwater invertebrates and provide a drink for passing birds. Find tutorials on the Museum of Zoology blog to give it a go yourself.
You may have spotted several birds taking a drink in that video. It is wonderful to see birds in our green spaces bringing with them so much colour and life and song. Our first guest this evening is Julia Mackenzie. She studies the birds nesting here in the Botanic Garden. Now here's a short film to give you a bit of a flavour of the work that she does, after which Julia will be joining us live to answer your questions, so do put them in the comments.
I'm Julia Mackenzie. And I've been monitoring the nest boxes in the Botanic Garden since, I think, 2004. Put them in a bag, so it's nice and dark for them. Back on top, and then we put the bag in the hole so that the parents don't go in the nest and see that there's nothing in there. So what we need to do is we need to get the weight of the nestlings, and we put the ring on them as well. So the ring has an individual number on it. So if I grab one of these rings, So this number on this ring is ART6013. And what I have to do is make a note of that in here, so I've already put that note in there. And then we know that each individual chick will have a unique identification, so if they're ever caught again, then we know where that nestling comes from, know a bit about its history. So if we can see, we've got, this is a blue tip nestling we've got here. So as you can see, his feathers are already starting to develop in there. So I would say that this nestling is about 12 days old, and he'll carry on developing in the nest. Oh, I don't know if you can see that, he's done a poo there, but what they do is they have them in little sacks like that, so what the parents can do is they grab them really easily to fly away with them. I'll just take that away from you. Down there. So what we do is we have these things called ringers pliers. And this is an A-ring, this is called, that goes on the blue tips. You have different size rings depending on what bird you have. And then you give it a squeeze this side. There's no way that it can hurt his leg at all. And then you squeeze it that side. And then you just double check that the ring isn't going to come off and that there's no overlap or anything on there. I don't know if you can see the ring there. And then what we do is we then weigh the bird. See how much it weighs. This bird weighs 8.77. And then we find an empty bag and we put the birds that we put the rings on in that bag there. Again, it's nice and dark for them so they don't get scared. It's just like being in a nest box. And you fold that up and you pop that there. What this is telling us, so when the nestlings are in there, the age of them are kind of 11 days. I think some researchers do them maybe 14 days. We've always done it for comparison on 11 or 12 days. But what it tells you is it's a good indication of how well they're going to survive when they leave the nest. So if they're a really good weight, then that indicates they've kind of got lots of food and they've been fed well, and that they've got a greater chance of survival when they get out into the wild. And this one weighs 8.29 grams. So to give a comparison, a adult blue tit will weigh around 9 to 10 grams. So they're getting up to kind of adult weight. So I also note down the wings as well. So this would be known as feathers short. So it means these wings, these feathers here are called the primaries. So they're its flight feathers. So when it's starting to come out of the pin here, you would call them feathers short. When they get down to that kind of length, they would be feathers medium. And when they're kind of their full length flight feathers, they would be called feathers long. So it's just codes that we put in, that we input the data with, that go off to the British Trust for Ornithology. And it takes a lot of training to be able to ring birds as well. I've been through years and years of training, catching them in mist nets, a variety of species as well. So I'll just go and pop these back and then we can let the parents go back in and start feeding them. They usually sort themselves out, get themselves all cozy back in the nest cup.
Okay, I'm joined now by Julia. Hello, welcome to Zoology Live.
Thank you.
So we saw you ringing blue tit nestlings in the film. What is life like in a blue tit nest? I mean, how many chicks are there? How long does it take them to develop?
Okay, so it's quite competitive in a blue tit nest. There's usually, I would say, in the Botanic Gardens, there's usually about 9 eggs that they'll lay. It can be up to 12. I think in a woodland they kind of have more. But yeah, you have both the male and the female blue tit. They'll be feeding the nestlings. And again, as I said, it's quite competitive because the nestlings open their mouth, they've got a big gape. They're begging for food. The one that begs the loudest often gets the food. So what you often find is you'll get probably 1 or 2 runts in the nest as well. So when food is aplenty, that's not an issue, and you can usually raise all of them. But when food supply is a bit low, then they do struggle to kind of feed all of them, and unfortunately, not all the nestlings make it. You usually find it's about up to 18 days and they're ready to fledge, so they go from 0 to 18 days, and then they basically adult size, and they'll leave the nest fully, all their feathers and everything, and they've left the nest. So it's quite a rapid process.
That's really a lot of, because they're small eggs, aren't they?
They are very small eggs. They are. Yeah. You can't believe when they come out, they are tiny.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. So, what are some of the factors then that make chicks more or less likely to fledge? So you said about sort of food supply.
Yeah. So I guess the biggest one is food supply. So for a blue tit and a great tit, which is what I study in the Botanic Garden, you find that the best food source for them would be caterpillars. If they struggle to find caterpillars, then they'll switch to other food sources such as spiders and other invertebrate prey. And again, if they're struggling to find food, then the nestlings do suffer. Other factors that can have an impact, I think weather can have an impact. So extreme rainfall is not really very good for the birds at all. It usually washes off the caterpillars from the leaves. And cold snaps as well are not good for them. So if they're starting to feed the nestlings and they've got kind of good weather, then they can find the food. But as soon as a cold snap, the female often has to spend her time brooding the enclosure. So you've then just got the male kind of going in and feeding backwards and forwards. So they've got half the supply of food going. So they do have a lot of difficulties. I think habitat is also another factor that can influence the kind of nesting fledging success as well. So.
How is a garden habitat then for that?
So the garden isn't great habitat. You would kind of look at the garden and you think, wow, this is an amazing habitat, but I guess if you kind of look out there, there's gaps that they have to cross. So you get those kind of gaps, and you also get other
big one.
So they tend to try and stay in a territory around their nests, but you do find that the birds in the Botanic Garden have to forage further afield than what they would in a woodland kind of habitat. So they have to forage further afield to find prey. So they're often going 50 metres in circumference around their nest, rather than like in a woodland they'd probably only go about 25 metres to be able to find food. So they do struggle in the gardens.
Okay. So you were ringing the nestlings. So what does how does bird ringing help us to understand sort of what's happening to birds and their population?
Okay, so bird ringing can tell us lots about it. You have long-term data sets. So you ring the birds. I think, as I said in the film, you put kind of a unique identification code on the bird. So if they're again caught somewhere else that also does bird ringing, then you know how far that bird's travelled. So you kind of monitor, I guess, migration routes. You can also monitor productivity, so that's how well the birds are breeding. Often they have like nest box schemes and nest finding schemes with the BTO, and that's the British Trust for Ornithology that kind of license all the ringing. And so I talked about productivity. What's the other? So the main thing is, I can't think of what. I'm trying to think.
Loads of data.
There is loads of data that you can get. Yeah, it's also the biggest one, I guess, is population changes as well. So you can see whether the populations are increasing or whether they're declining. So and that's also. I mean, there's other things. I think there's ringing. You take biometric data as well. So you take data on the wing length and the weight of the bird as well, and that can kind of tell you a bit about the individual species sizes as well. So you get males and females will differ in size, but also you get in different habitats that they might also differ in size, so they might be adapting themselves to different habitats. I think there's been some research in Barcelona recently, and they've found that urban blue tits, I think it's blue tits they're actually smaller than the kind of forest counterparts. So so and maybe that might be due to them struggling in urban environments to try and find food. So that they it has a consequence on the kind of weight and the size of the bird as well.
Oh, that's really
and
interesting.
also. Other things, I mean, in the Botanic Gardens, I put colourings on the parent birds as well.
Okay.
So that means that you don't actually have to catch the bird. You can look through binoculars and identify the individuals with their colouring combinations.
Yeah.
So I know if I've got repeat nesters at different boxes, and then you can also do behavioural studies as well. So I did some foraging kind of behavioural studies and could figure out where the birds, how far they were going for the nests. And you kind of use like mapping and GIS and everything with that. So.
Oh, clever.
Yeah.
It sounds very good. Yeah. So, like say, you've been monitoring the birds here in the garden for quite a number of years now. Have you seen sort of changes in patterns then, and the success and things like that?
I mean, as I've talked about, they don't breed very well in the Botanic Gardens compared to what would be their optimum habitat, which would be a woodland. Yes, if I talk a bit about the woodland, they time their breeding to coincide with the peak of caterpillars on oak trees, which is often in kind of the UK, it's often oak woodlands you find. And there's often this peak. In the Botanic Gardens, they can't do that because there's such a wide variety of plants, and lots of the plants are exotic. So I talked about the gaps that you can see here, but you also get what's called functional gaps. So functional gaps are where there might be a tree or a shrub in the location, but it's not particularly useful for them for food.
Yeah.
So with exotic plants, you find that the insects, like the native insects from the UK, aren't actually adapted to the exotic plants, so you don't find as many, so you don't find the kind of biomass you would on the other ones. So in the Botanic Gardens, you don't actually find that many caterpillars compared to a woodland that you would.
Okay.
So they are having to switch to a greater diet. It's not all doom and gloom though. I mean, they still do get fledglings out, and we actually did some research, I think back in 2012, because we're doing all this long-term data. I think it was a particularly bad year for rainfall, so we had some real extreme rainfall, and we compared that to kind of the local woodlands around Cambridgeshire. And the birds in the woodlands actually did really, really badly that year in particular, but the birds in the Botanic Gardens didn't do too badly. They just kind of did as they would usually, so they're still getting a few fledglings out. And it just shows that because they're just timed in the woodlands to this peak of the caterpillars, then as soon as the rainfalls wash them all off, they can't really switch and kind of find the food on the other ones, whereas they've got a wider variety of food here. So I guess extreme climatic weather might be bad for kind of the woodland birds, but it might not be so bad in urban environments where they're more generalist, I guess, than specialist.
Okay. So I guess maybe looking, because we're getting extreme weather all the time with climate change, so maybe our garden habitats are going to be even more important then. Yeah. No, it's really, really interesting. Do blue tits, do they have just one clutch a year then? Because I know some birds have multiple.
Yes, blue tits tend to have one clutch a year. I don't think I've ever had a case of them having two in here. Great tits will sometimes have two clutches if their first one fails.
Okay.
They can then start again, and you do find that the great tits in urban environments, they often start laying their eggs a bit earlier than what the blue tits do. Blue tits, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference between woodland and urban environments. They tend to lay their eggs kind of at the same time. And I wonder if that's so that the great tits, if they do fail, then they can kind of start again. And they have that time to be able to do that. Whereas so they're laying a bit earlier than what the blue tits do.
Okay, interesting, different strategies going
on. Even though they seem quite similar, they're actually quite different. They have kind of different foraging strategies and different ecological niches as well.
Oh, interesting. So, I mean, can monitoring birds in this way, can they tell us about sort of changing wildlife and habitats more generally?
I guess so, because they kind of live all in an ecosystem. So if something affects birds in that ecosystem, then it's going to also affect the other kind of biodiversity within that ecosystem too. So if you've got habitat loss, which is happening, I guess, across the world and not just the UK, that would affect, I guess, bird populations, but it's also going to affect kind of mammal populations and the invertebrate populations. So the habitat loss will have kind of a negative effect, I guess, on that. I think there's been some work at the moment. There's been kind of a big drive for rewilding as well, and that can have, I guess, the converse effect. So that can help to kind of increase biodiversity. So you see that it won't just be the birds that are benefiting from that, but also the other wildlife as well, and the kind of plant communities as well. So.
So we've got a question from the audience.
Oh, okay.
So Zoe is asking, how long does it take before birds leave the nest, and do their legs get wider as they grow and need bigger rings? Because it seemed quite a small ring that was going
yes,
on there.
it does seem a small ring, but actually it's the opposite way round.
Oh.
So the birds in the nest have fatter legs than the adults do, so they actually get thinner.
Oh,
so
yeah.
great tit nestlings actually take a B ring, which is the next size up from the blue tits. But an adult, I think you have to, if you catch a great tit, you have to now measure it. It used to just take an A ring, but you have to now measure its leg to see how wide it is. So it either takes an A ring or a B ring, but they do get smaller.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like babies with their chunky legs.
Yeah, exactly, the chunky legs. I think just because they're in the nest, and I guess I'm not going to try. I don't exactly know the mechanism for it, but I think just because maybe they're not out and about, and I think that maybe it's something to do with thermoregulatory thing as well to keep them warm. So it might be that. But I think she asked about how long they're in there as well.
Long they're in there.
They're in there for, as I said, about 18 days in the nest, and then they'll leave.
Yeah.
So they'll leave the nest, and then they still stay with their parents for several weeks after that. They still beg for food as well, so even if they're sitting on a tree and like a caterpillar might be crawling up to it, it still won't pick it up and eat it. It will beg for the parent coming back with the food. So the parents do start to look quite stressed around this time. And worn out. So
How long is it between sort of laying the egg and it hatching?
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Yeah, so what they do is the female lays 1 egg a day until she completely finishes the clutch, and then she'll start incubating the whole clutch so that they hatch all together.
Right.
That's not true in all bird species. I think owls and things, they have kind of asynchronous hatching, so that the ones that come first have the better chance of surviving, but then they can all survive if there's lots of food about. But the blue tits and great tits have that kind of strategy, although they can still delay incubation if you have a cold snap, so they can just stop, or they can either stop laying or they can delay starting the incubation process. So they don't kind of do it as soon as they finish. It just depends on what the weather conditions are like. So they have got ways of kind of fine-tuning when they're going to hatch as well.
I mean, we've been having such crazy springs lately.
It has,
sort of really late cold snaps. So.
That's the thing. I think this year with the birds, we had, it was quite warm early on, so the birds that did lay early, they kind of got through that and they managed to feed, and they were quite good weights, but the later ones, they were not quite so good weights because we had those cold snaps. So you can see it really does have an impact, the kind of weather.
Interesting. So my last question for you is, what can we do to support birds in our own spaces? Have you got any top tips of what we can do to support them?
I guess top tips, if it's possible, planting native kind of deciduous plants and trees. Good ones are kind of ones with nice berries on and like nuts and things like that. I know it's not easy because not everyone's got big gardens that they can put trees in, but that's ideal. Or maybe having an area like a wildlife kind of garden area just to attract like birds and things. I know people put feeders up and stuff, so if you do put feeders up, I probably wouldn't recommend putting feeders up, especially not putting peanuts up during the breeding season. Because sometimes the birds, if they're really struggling for food, they can switch to like peanuts and try and feed it to the nestlings, and it's not good. They can't digest it. But also the other thing is really important is to clean your feeders as well, and keep them clean, because there has been cases of disease transmission between them. I think greenfinches and chaffinches in particular were hit quite badly with like a parasitic disease that can be transmitted via saliva. So if one of them's got it and they're kind of on a feeder or the bird table, then it can kind of transmit quite easily. So disinfecting and cleaning kind of once a fortnight or something like that would be good ideas.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. That's been really, really interesting. And I have to say it was such a treat to see the little nestlings being ringed as well. I really enjoyed that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we'll soon be talking with our second expert of the evening, Ed Turner, who'll be sharing some of his work on insect diversity with us. But first, here's a way that you can support insect life in your own green spaces. when you start looking, you'd be amazed by how many mini beasts live in our gardens and green spaces. But if you want to see a mega diverse ecosystem, the place to go is a tropical rainforest, and that's exactly what our next scientist does. Here's Ed Turner, our curator of insects at the Museum of Zoology, to explain a little about his research. And Ed will be joining us live after this short film, so do pop your questions in the comments.
Hi, my name's Ed Turner. I'm curator of insects at the University Museum of Zoology, and we're here in the Tropical House in the Botanic Garden in Cambridge. I want to tell you a bit about the work we do in Southeast Asia, which is in collaboration with universities in Indonesia and Malaysia. One of the things we're really interested in there is understanding why the tropics are so diverse, why there are more species there than anywhere else in the world. That's particularly true in Southeast Asia. One of the groups we work on are insects that live in epiphytes. And epiphytes are plants that grow on other plants, but not parasitically, so not like mistletoe. They don't steal nutrients or anything like that. Rather, they use the other plants as support. And you can find those in tropical rainforests, probably right up in the canopy, maybe 80 metres above the ground. You can also find them in agricultural landscapes, oil palm plantations and things like that. And in all these different habitats, they can be really important for providing habitat and food for insects. And they do that partly because lots of other animals live in there as well, partly because insects feed on the leaves of these plants, but partly also because of the unique habitats that these environments can provide. I'm going to give you an example of this here. This is one of my favourites. I've done a lot of work on this over the years. This is the beautiful bird's nest fern. It's from the old world tropics, so it's found particularly in Malaysia, Indonesia, it's in Australia, in Africa. And it's got these amazing leaves. You can buy this as a houseplant, makes a very good houseplant. They're usually not quite as big as this in your house. And these leaves are basically like drain pipes. So this is growing on the ground here. In a rainforest, it could be growing 50 metres or 60 metres above the ground in the crown of an enormous tropical tree. And what it does is it basically funnels down into its base here water and also leaf litter that falls out of the rainforest tree. And it basically makes its own soil in the canopy. So if you imagine, if you're an insect and you're living up on the exposed upper branches of a rainforest tree, this is absolutely ideal because it's really moist, it's really wet, it's got loads of decaying leaves and other organic matter. It's the perfect place for you to live. So you get loads of insects in there, you get lizards living in there, living on the insects, you get bats sometimes roosting underneath these things, a whole habitat, a whole environment, an island in the sky if you like. That's true for the old world tropics. It's also true of the new world tropics as well. So we go across to Central and South America, and the group that dominates there are these fantastic plants, which are bromeliads. And these do the same thing. You can see they've got these big exposed leaves here, again funneled like a drain pipe to get in all the water and nutrients that fall into these plants. But with the bromeliads, they even hold the water. So in the ferns, they almost have like a sponge at their base. In the bromeliads, it's actually water. And that's true here in the tropical house as well. So if I just, you can see this on camera, if I really pour it out, if I just pour it out a bit, you see, there's absolutely loads of water in there. This is just in the tropical house, it's probably been misted, but you can see how well these plants are holding the water. And if we're in the tropics, if we're in Panama or somewhere like that, if I was to do that, probably my hand would then be covered in insects. So we all sorts of aquatic insects, mayfly larvae, all kinds of things, which are adapted not just to a watery environment, but to actually living in bromeliads. It's extraordinary stuff, this huge diversity of life, which is being supported by plants growing on other plants. And that's part of the reason why we're interested in these and why we do research in the tropics, because it's about understanding what it is about the tropics which makes it so extraordinarily diverse.
Okay, before we start on chatting to Ed, who is here with me live, we had one late question from the last interview from Timothy, age 9, who asked, we have a cotton Easter tree that the birds love. It's a non-native tree which is invasive though. Should we take it out? And I've just asked sort of Julia, probably no, it's fine, so it's fine to leave it in. Do you have any opinions on that one?
I think they're really good actually. I mean,
Yeah.
they are quite invasive, so, but if it's in a garden setting, I don't think it matters too much.
Yeah.
And you get all these lovely little red berries at the end of the year, and they do get eaten by everything. I've got one in the bottom of my garden, and all the berries disappear within about 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So obviously being used by something.
Okay, so it's fine to leave it in your garden in that case. So hello, welcome Ed Turner. So this is Ed, our curator of insects, who you've just seen talking about the ferns that are in the tropical houses here in the Botanic Garden. So Ed, I was wondering, can you tell us a little bit more about your work in Southeast Asia? So how do you find out about the insects that are living in these ferns? I mean, they are a really long way up, a lot of them, aren't they?
Some of them are very high, although to be honest, most of my work's been on ones which are slightly lower down.
That's very sensible.
Very sensible. I've done a couple of big climbs up the tree, which was terrifying actually, but very exciting. But most of the work we've done historically has been in the understory of rainforests and in secondary forests, so forest areas that have regrown. And we've increasingly done lots of work in oil palm plantations, which obviously are human-made habitats, very common now in Southeast Asia and across the tropics. And one of the things we've been interested there is how you can make agricultural areas like oil palm more biodiverse, and it turns out having things like epiphytes can be helpful in that.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. So when you're out doing field work, are there any insects or other animals that you get particularly excited to see when you're out there?
I think it's all really exciting.
Yeah.
My kind of work is a very generic
Yes.
answer, isn't it? I mean, I think you can see equally exciting stuff, whether in the beautiful botanic garden or whether you're in the rainforest of Southeast Asia. I really do. You can see
Yeah.
completely world-class natural history, biology, species, wherever you are, really. There are some certain things you see which are just kind of intriguing. It's often not particular species, but for me, it's things doing things which are quite unexpected or things I haven't seen before, and stuff like that can be really interesting. One of my favourite was I was working in an oil palm plantation a few years ago, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and it had been raining really heavily, and the whole plantation had kind of flooded, and I found this raft of ants.
Wow.
And apparently they do this, but basically a whole group of ants which had all joined together, they'd kind of bitten onto each other's legs and
So they
things
made
like that.
their own raft.
They'd made their
then?
own raft, and they were just kind of floating along. And I think that's just an amazing bit of biology. I'm not sure how
Yeah.
adaptive that was, but I have found in literature since that some species do that to escape floods or to enable them to kind of get away from problem situations. So quite amazing.
Real
Yeah.
teamwork there then.
Proper
as well.
teamwork,
Proper
yeah,
teamwork.
properly social. Use social
Yes,
insects.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess that's something really surprising that you've seen. I guess, so that kind of thing over seeing orangutans and things like that, I'm guessing.
But
or do you-
orangutans are fine.
Yeah.
When we've been working in Borneo, you see orangutans quite often, and they are
Yeah.
really fun. I mean, they're one of those things that you can feel the connection with people really clearly.
Yeah.
And they might make eye contact, which is quite
Wow.
a strange thing. It's very disconcerting
Not
for an
had that
animal to
with
make
an
eye
animal,
contact.
yeah.
But they're amazing things, but they're quite lumbering. And I think, I don't know, they're not really beautiful in that kind of way. They're very interesting, and it's
Yeah.
always fun to see them. But yeah, for me, the insects are probably the more exciting bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sensibly, I'm sure that's the case for most of your audience.
Yeah. Tell us if you prefer an orangutan or the insects they
Don't do that.
So, you're talking about the epiphytes, and you mentioned how in the oil palm plantations it seems to really help with the biodiversity having epiphytes there in the oil palm as well. Do we have anything like that in this country that creates those kind of mini habitats within habitats?
So we don't tend to have epiphytes in the same sort of way because really it needs that high sunlight, that high rainfall, that kind of conditions, constant leaf fall as well, of course, because lots of tropical trees don't drop their leaves just at certain times of the year as they do in the temperates. They'll constantly be getting leaf litter falling in, and the trick of lots of these epiphytes is they basically gather the leaves up, as we saw in that video with the beautiful bird's nest ferns. They've got leaves like drain pipes that channel in all the water and the leaf litter and things like that, and they create their own soil in the sky, if you like.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really work in a temperate system quite as well. There are cases where you can get plants that are growing on other plants, but it's rather rarer. I think examples for this sort of thing in the UK are probably things like tree holes. You can get tree holes which have got very specific fauna in them, so they've got all of they kind of often hold water or they're spongy. You can get things found in there which won't be found in the rest of the tree, for example, so that might be an example of it.
Yeah.
The other things where you get very patchy habitat, of course, is wetlands, so ponds and ephemeral pools and things like that, where you can really get very different sort of habitat. But it's the same sort of setup, a whole group of animals which might be living not exactly isolated, but very much restricted to particular habitats.
Yeah. So probably quite a lot in our traditional habitat around Cambridge with lots of wetlands and things like that.
Yeah, I think where you've got those kind of temporary pools and things like
Yeah.
that, you'll get certain suites of animals living in those, and they won't be found more widely. Yeah.
Yeah. No, very
It's one of the reasons why putting in a garden pond is so good, of course, because you're kind of bringing all these things in that wouldn't otherwise have a habitat.
Yeah. So definitely put in a garden
Put in a
pond like we
garden
showed we showed you earlier. So we hear a lot about the loss of rainforests to agriculture, and we've already mentioned the oil palm plantations. Is there anything that we can do to sort of better understand this impact and maybe lessen it a bit?
Yeah, it's a tricky and a nuanced thing, because obviously we've got a rising human population we want to feed, and more important than a rising number of people is a change in diet. So lots of people are moving more towards a Western diet, which means more protein and more vegetable oil, like palm oil. So those are the sort of choices that people can really make. If we were to each kind of forego a portion of chips a day or something like that, a lot of the problems with deforestation would kind of go away. So it's not a huge change. Not everyone has to be vegan or vegetarian even. But if people think a bit more about when they have beef, when they have protein, sort of meat and things like that, and try and reduce it, go for some veggie options. We're in the Botanic Garden, it's a very good place to talk about veggie options. But doing that a couple of times a week can make a real difference. So that's something people can concretely do. That wasn't really your question, but in terms of understanding, I think it's easy to kind of conflate current agriculture with new agriculture. And it's expansion of agriculture that really comes at the big cost of biodiversity in the tropics. And that's a huge problem, really massive problem, because of course tropical rainforests are among the most biodiverse habitats in the world. With hundreds of species of trees in some cases per hectare. So Botanic Garden's incredibly diverse, but rainforests of course can be diverse without that being human-made. And of course if you lose that and you convert it to an agricultural crop, you lose all those species, and then there's loads of plants. We had your previous guest talking about how native species are really good for lots of insects. Of course the same is true of every single native species in the tropical rainforest. They've all got their own suite of insects. They've all got their own suite of insects feeding on insects, or even insects feeding on insects feeding on insects, hyperparasitoids. And so when you get all of this stuff together, what it means is if you lose that diversity, you lose those species. So anything we can do to reduce demand and reduce deforestation is the way to save a lot of this tropical diversity.
Because palm oil, it's in a lot of stuff, isn't it?
And in a way, it's a controversial point. It's quite a good crop. Because it's incredibly productive. So what it kind of means for vegetable oil is you need far less area of palm oil than you do most other people in every other vegetable oil crop. So once it's there, it's really good and it can be managed. Lots of our work now is looking at ways you can manage it more sustainably once it's there. But because it grows in the tropics, obviously its footprint when it first gets established is really bad.
So it's about trying to be pragmatic and supporting people and planet at the same time.
And you combine now increasingly kind of like more sustainable palm oil. So again, that's a way to go. That's a clear signal that people can make when they choose things in the supermarket. And lots of big companies are moving towards more sustainable palm oil.
That's good to hear.
Which is really good.
So is there like a symbol or something like that?
It looks kind of it looks a bit like a sort of like a green kind of green squash starfish. But it's meant to be a palm. But you can look for that. But I guess anything you can do to kind of go for that. I wouldn't necessarily go for no palm oil because you've got vegetable oils coming from somewhere. It's going to be having an impact. But going for the same or marketed one is really good.
Okay, so go for sustainable. Try and reduce the amount, but don't get rid of it altogether because it's actually to go for something else would probably be worse for the planet.
For palm oil, but try and reduce the amount of vegetable oil you eat. That's always going to be a good idea, probably for your health.
Probably for your health as well.
And also for the environment.
And definitely reduce the amount of sort of meat and things like that you're eating. So
these are the big things that have footprints as far as diversity worldwide is concerned.
Oh, thank you so much for that. That's been really, really interesting, and I've learned a lot about how to be a bit more sustainable as well. So thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure.
Okay. So if you want to get a flavour of the rainforest here in Cambridge, do come and visit the Botanic Garden glass houses where we filmed Ed and the Ferns. It's a really magical space to be in. Now, I've been talking about how rainforests support biodiversity, and they've got all these different sort of mini habitats inside them. So now this is something we can do in our own green spaces that will help us in supporting wildlife by not being quite so tidy with our gardening. So here's a little bit to show you why that's important. A big thank you to our experts and to you for joining us on our journey into wildlife past, present and future, this Zoology Live. But our wildlife watching isn't over. We'll be back in the garden from 5 p.m. on Friday evening to 5 p.m. on Saturday for our BioBlitz, when we'll be counting as many species as possible in 24 hours. Both Julia and Ed will be there too, and we have loads of wildlife walks and workshops that you can book onto. The data we collect together will help us to better understand the diversity of this amazing place. So we're going to end this evening with a little taster of what you can expect if you come along. Until then, happy wildlife watching.